Hello and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious, unbelievable that these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. Be sure to check out the website, themysteriesofhistory.com, where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes, and of course the blog, where we will give you an extra insight into each episode, as well as all sorts of unbelievable historical content. You can also find us on social media, where you can let us know what you think of the podcast episodes, or even suggest a new historical mystery for us to investigate. And now you can even support the show. Follow the link on the website or our Instagram page and donate any amount that you may wish to help us to keep this great podcast going. Any donations are much appreciated. But don't worry, we'll keep going anyway. We love a historical mystery far too much to stop anytime soon. So now, let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is working hard to finish his Requiem Mass, the Requiem in D minor. A piece that would cement his name as a composer of utter brilliance for all time. However, in the autumn of 1791, Mozart fell seriously ill and became convinced that he was going to die. He would talk of death and even suggested that the Requiem was being composed for himself. Most interestingly, he said the following: "I feel definitely that I will not last much longer. I am sure that I have been poisoned. I cannot rid myself of this idea. Someone has given me Aqua Tofana and calculated the precise time of my death." Sophie Weber, Mozart's sister-in-law, reported that his last words were, "I have the taste of death on my tongue." Historians have argued ever since about the precise cause of Mozart's death. Most support the theory that Mozart had syphilis, rheumatic fever, or even death caused by eating undercooked pork. Some scholars, though, conclude that Wolfgang Mozart was murdered by poisoning. In the hushed alleys of 17th century Rome, at the height of the Renaissance, whispers spoke of a lethal libation, Aqua Tofana. This slow-acting poison, disguised as harmless manna di San Nicola, offered a clandestine escape for women trapped in devastating marriages. Though brutal, these acts were born from societal constraints that denied women autonomy and recourse. Here we'll examine how Aqua Tofana emerged as a grim symbol of resistance amid arranged marriages, and explore the broader arc of women's rights through an era where a woman's role was to be obedient, if not silent altogether. In the shadowed world of 17th century Europe, especially in cities like Palermo in Sicily and Naples and Rome in mainland Italy, Aqua Tofana emerged not just as a poison, but as a symbol of silent rebellion. It offered an illicit yet accessible form of empowerment for women whose lives were circumscribed by the institution of arranged and often violent marriages. Though morally troubling, the story of Aqua Tofana forces us to ask, when all lawful recourse is stripped from somebody, what tools remain for resistance? The precise formula of Aqua Tofana was a closely guarded secret, passed orally among trusted women within underground networks. Most accounts agree it was composed primarily of arsenic trioxide, mixed with lead and sometimes belladonna, or more commonly known as the perennial plant, deadly nightshade. These are lethal toxins in small, easily dosed quantities. Aqua Tofana was odourless, tasteless and slow-acting, making it nearly impossible to detect without modern forensic tools. Administered over the course of several days or weeks, it caused symptoms, vomiting, dehydration, weakness, gastrointestinal pain that mimicked natural illnesses such as dysentery or tuberculosis. This slow approach allowed the victim's suffering to appear organic or natural. Because sudden death would arouse suspicion, the poison's genius lay in its subtlety. Victims often died after appearing ill for some time, sparking little concern and allowing the widow to escape scrutiny. A contemporary weekly British magazine called Chambers Journal highlighted the horror of a strong man reduced to nothing by the acts of his desperate wife. The extract from the journal reads as follows: administered in wine or tea or some other liquid by the flattering treacheress, it produced but a scarcely noticeable effect. The husband became a little out of sorts, felt weak and languid, so little indisposed that he would scarcely call it in a medical man. After the second dose of poison, this weakness and languor became more pronounced. The beautiful Medea, who expressed so much anxiety for her husband's indisposition, would scarcely be an object of suspicion, and perhaps would prepare her husband's food, as prescribed by the doctor, with her own fair hands. In this way, the third drop would be administered, and would prostrate even the most vigorous man. The doctor would be completely puzzled to see that the apparently simple ailment did not surrender to his drugs, and while he would be still in the dark as to its nature, another dose would be given, until at length death would claim the victim for its own. To save her fair fame, the wife would demand a post-mortem examination. Result: nothing, except that the woman was able to pose as a slandered innocent, and then it would be remembered that her husband died without either pain, inflammation, fever or spasms. If after this the woman within a year or two formed a new connection, nobody could blame her. For everything considered, it would be a sore trial for her to continue to bear the name of a man whose relatives had accused her of poisoning him. So I think this is a really fascinating extract from, or a contemporary extract from the Times, that really demonstrates the subtleties and brilliance, if you like, of Aqua Tofana as a slow poison. I say brilliance, but brilliance in terms of allowing a wife, a disgruntled wife, to dispose of her husband and end a unhappy marriage with very little prospect of ever being convicted of any sort of crime. Remember, this is the Renaissance period that we're talking about, so the mid to late 1600s onwards. Any sort of DNA evidence or autopsies of a body that would be able to prove any type of poisoning simply did not exist. The poison itself was often disguised in small vials or glass bottles labelled Manna di San Nicola, and this was a healing oil from St. Nicholas's tomb. It was supposed to be drops from the reliquary of the bones of St. Nicholas, if you like. So this gave it religious legitimacy in society. So this is something that wouldn't necessarily be questioned amongst the general population. Other bottles of Aqua Tofana were distributed in cosmetic bottles or perfumes, cleverly playing on social expectations of women's vanity and domestic innocence. The distribution system was so refined that women could request it under the guise of buying beauty products. So the critical question to ask is, who was the mastermind behind Aqua Tofana? Where did this poison come from? So Although often credited as the mastermind behind Aqua Tofana, Giulia Tofana is more likely a semi-mythologized figure. Historical confusion surrounds her identity. Some scholars believe she may have been Giulia Mangiardi, daughter of Teofana di Adamo, who was executed in Palermo in Sicily in 1633 for selling poison. The Tofana name likely served as a brand, a recognisable label for a type of poison available to desperate women. Over a 50-year career, Giuliana Tofana is credited with over 600 victims. Indeed, it has been written that there was not a lady in Naples who had not some of it lying openly on her toilette among her perfumes. She alone knows the file and can distinguish it. This quote comes from Abbe Gangliani, who lived a century after Tofana, but I included it because I think it really gives you an idea of perhaps how common and widely known Aqua Tofana certainly may have been amongst the upper classes of the Renaissance era in Sicily and Italy. The real network behind the widespread use of Aqua Tofana was likely more collective and female-dominated. A key figure was Geronima Spana, a Roman astrologer and herbalist who worked alongside women like Giovanna de Grandi, Maria Spinola and Laura Crisbaldi. They operated out of modest homes, laundries and apothecaries, where they provided advice, charms, fortune-telling and sometimes poison. You have to remember that this is a time before modern medicine and modern science. So for those of you who don't know, an apothecary was really like a Renaissance era pharmacy, if you like. It's not to say that the people who ran and worked in apothecaries weren't very intelligent and knowledgeable. There's no doubt that these people knew a lot about natural products and plants and were able to mix them and blend them to make what are regarded now as pretty mild and in some cases very effective medicines. This was a legitimate place, or one of the few legitimate places where somebody could go and buy something that may well assist them in the recovery from an ailment or illness. An apothecary was a really central part of a community. This is not to say, though, that some people did view apothecaries with some suspicion. If you remember from previous podcasts, we've talked about witchcraft and the occult, and apothecaries were tainted with some of that narrative, if you like, as well. People often didn't understand how these women, and it often was women, could blend plants or liquids together and create something that would make people better. That wasn't really very well understood at the time. And of course, if you've listened to the podcast episode we did about witchcraft, you'll understand that anything out of the normal in society was viewed with a good dose of skepticism. So it's no wonder that a lot of apothecaries were indeed accused of witchcraft. It was a fine line between helping people and trying to remain under the radar, if you like, from the wider societal prejudices which most certainly existed at the time. So as I've just mentioned, any medicine that was produced in an apothecary had to be paid for. So this naturally meant that it was the wealthy, or indeed the noble women, that were most likely to purchase Aqua Tofana. Now, as we'll begin to discuss in a moment, it was indeed the wealthy noblewomen that were, more often than not, trapped in abusive and strategically arranged marriages. Divorce, we must remember, especially in Catholic regions like Italy, was basically impossible. Separation from a husband, even in the case of domestic abuse, physical abuse, or infidelity, required ecclesiastical approval or substantial dowries, payments, both of which were unavailable to most women. Poison then became the de facto form of divorce in many cases. So this brings us nicely to the point where we should talk about arranged marriage during this time period, so mid 1600s all the way through to the 19th century, where marriage largely functioned as a transactional aligning amongst families, certainly for the wealthier upper classes. This existed from sort of medieval Europe all the way through to the early modern era, so we're talking, all the way up to sort of the 19th century. It was all about preserving lineage, consolidating wealth. In Tudor England, aristocratic marriages were carefully arranged with dowries, these are payments, and inheritance stakes carefully negotiated by often the fathers. Just think of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Each of those marriages, well, that's not true at all, is it? Anne Boleyn is certainly an exception, but initially people like Thomas Cromwell were most certainly trying to vie for the best bride for Henry VIII. This was often based upon political motivations, alignments, arrangements with other countries. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, is a perfect example of that. Catherine of Aragon was Spanish, and it was suggested that a Spanish alliance would be very beneficial to England. As it turns out, Henry VIII didn't get on with Catherine of Aragon at all and found her not to be to his liking, shall we say. But it just gives you an example of arranged marriages. So this philosophy existed throughout all of the noble classes and wealthier upper class throughout Europe, like we said. Under doctrines like coverture, a married woman became legally subsumed within a husband's identity, losing rights to property, earnings, and contracts. Legal authorities likened marriage's effects to slavery. Daniel Defoe once famously called it legalized prostitution. Essentially, a married woman's identity was incorporated into that of her husband's. However, even among the peasantry, marriages were rarely romantic. Love marriages before the 19th century were often frowned upon. These oppressive structures left many women with limited options when trapped in abusive or unwelcome marriages. Just imagine you're an 18-year-old, legally a woman, but just, a girl really, a very naive girl in the time period. And you are told to marry somebody 3 times your age. This was not uncommon during this time period. A woman's role was to provide heirs to wealthy gentlemen's fortunes. And women, unfortunately, they often died in childbirth. Medical care was not as it is today by any standard. All the way up to the 19th century and early 20th century, childbirth was a very, very risky business. And as a result of this, many wealthy men, landed gentry if you like, married several times in their lifetimes in order to produce an heir and continue their good family name, if you like. So we've set the context here, and we begin to see how Juliana Tofana and her network catered to this need. Her network included cosmeticians, astrologers, and wise women who worked in apothecaries, and they facilitated discreet access and trust across social classes for these women that, as we've said, had no legal rights and literally no way of getting out of an unhappy marriage. Just imagine how some of these women must have felt during this time. It's not like today at all, where a woman could, seek a divorce, and a divorce could be completed, I don't know, perhaps within something like 6 months. And, that woman then could continue with her life. And society would barely blink an eye these days. And, the woman wouldn't be discredited in any way. We're talking about a completely different time. And we begin to understand, I think, why Aqua Tofana existed. As we've just mentioned, Juliana Tofana and her network are reportedly responsible for over 600 or more deaths between about 1633 and 1651. And this information comes from court records, although historians do caution these numbers, as they may have been exaggerated or perhaps driven by torture, confession, or indeed perhaps some element of myth. However, Aqua Tofana did capture the imagination of contemporaries. It symbolised a dangerous form of female empowerment and revenge, and pamphlets, crime annals and court literature really sort of sensationalised the story, reinforcing social anxieties about what was termed toxic women. Pope Alexander VII was also prompted to issue edicts restricting arsenic distillation and ingredient purchases in an attempt to stamp out access to poisons, but such measures proved ineffective, and Aqua Tofana was here to stay. In 1659, though, things changed. A client who changed her mind mid-use confessed to her husband or priest, after most probably being tortured after her arrest. Papal authorities were alerted, leading to a widespread investigation known as the Spana prosecution, which lasted between January 1659 and March 1660. The Spana prosecution implicated over 40 individuals, including producers, sellers, and clients alike, all operating in Rome in Italy. 5 women, Geronima Spana, Giovanna de Grandi, Maria Spinola, Laura Crisbaldi, and Graziosa Farina, were publicly executed in July 59 in the Campo de' Fiori, a site infamous for executions. All of these ladies died by hanging. Many of their clients were imprisoned for life, fined or shamed, but most were spared execution due to their high social standing. This points to a gendered and class-based double standard. The female distributors were treated as masterminds, while the female clients were often painted as foolish or misled. Despite the scandal, the authorities' response was not only moral but political. The widespread use of poison by women challenged patriarchal control and the sanctity of marriage, threatening to destabilize social order. The Roman Inquisition feared not just death by poison, but disobedience by women. And what of Tofana herself? Some claim she died peacefully in 1651, never brought to justice, and lived out her days in a convent, unsuspected of any crime. Historical records become hazy during this time period, and there are those that suggest that Tofana herself was executed in 1659 alongside the broader network of women during the Spana prosecution of 1659. However, either way, there are scholars that do agree that the family tradition was continued by Tofana's daughter, Girolama Spara, who in 1657 was responsible for one of the most high-profile poisonings. It is reported that Spara supplied Aqua Tofana to Maria Aldobrandini, the Duchess of Ceri, the wife of the Duke of Ceri, one of the most high-profile Roman noblemen. It would appear that the scandal was hushed up. Aldobrandini never stood trial and lived out the rest of her days without any conviction until her death in 1703. The 19th century scholar Alessandro Adamolo suggests that although Spara's chief motivation was money, she sometimes did supply Aqua Tofana free to poorer women in desperate situations, out of pity no doubt, or because she was so angered by the abuse that women were suffering. Aqua Tofana was a powerful tool at some women's disposal during the Renaissance period. However, Aqua Tofana was not the only route of resistance. Some women fled abusive households, if they were lucky, or did seek annulments. Others wielded indirect measures, such as writing wills, forging alliances or leveraging dowries for independence. But in overwhelmingly patriarchal and religious legal landscapes, such options were rare and costly. However, as the era of the Enlightenment wore on, voices like Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges began to challenge legal inequalities. Mary Astle, in her 1694 essay titled A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, used language that elevated women's education and autonomy, arguing for women's recognition as rational beings. In the 19th century, legislative shifts began eroding coverture. In Britain, the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and again in 1882 finally allowed married women to own property and control earnings. Similar reforms in America granted married women rights over wages, assets, and child custody. However, it wasn't until the 20th century when divorce reforms, England's Divorce Law Reform Act of 1969, finally acknowledged marriage breakdown without blame, reflecting the increasing priority of personal fulfillment over duty. Aqua Tofana was not just a poison, it is a window into the desperate circumstances of women in early modern Italy, a reflection of legal inequalities and a testament to how myth and history intertwine. It remains a chilling emblem of social injustice, gendered resistance, and the way marginalised groups may resort to extreme measures when all legal avenues are blocked. As marriage evolved from societal necessity to a consensual partnership, women's legal and cultural emancipation erased the need for such extreme resistance. Yet the legacy of Aqua Tofana endures, a stark reminder of how far we've come and how critical it remains to protect and expand marital autonomy and gender equality. I think there's no doubt that this is a really important part of history that I think has really sort of largely gone under the radar. I certainly knew nothing about Aqua Tofana and the poisonings that were occurring largely during the Renaissance period, and I suspect a lot of people are the same. In fact, this podcast episode was at the request of Kate at the Cozy Cup Book Club podcast. Be sure to check out their podcast too. It's a great place to listen to some book reviews of new and upcoming authors. And so many thanks to Kate for introducing myself and our listeners to the incredible world of Renaissance Italy, a really important part of history that, like I say, has gone under the radar for far too long. the story of Aqua Tofana and its place in Renaissance Italy, especially, cannot be underestimated. It's a really important part of social history, and really demonstrates, I think, how far women's rights and equality has come in the last couple of hundred years. Like I've said in this podcast, we're at a place that is very far removed from the Renaissance period of the late 16 and 1700s. Certainly in terms of women's rights, we've come a long, long way in terms of arranged marriages, certainly in Western cultures anyway. If anybody is interested in learning some more information about the use of Aqua Tofana during the Renaissance period, there's a really in-depth and well-researched essay written by the historian and broadcaster Mike Dash, which I'll share on our blog. It's got some really incredible additional stories, which I haven't included in the podcast, but of further poisonings and treachery amongst the noble classes during this time. It's a really fascinating read, so I'd really recommend having a look at that. Another recommendation which I'll give is have a look at the trilogy of books, fictional books written by Deborah Swift. They're really well researched and are actually based upon the life of Giuliana Tofana, and they do closely follow the historical narrative that I've sort of outlined in this podcast. The first one is called The Poison Keeper, which follows the life of Giuliana Tofana after her mother is arrested for poisoning the Duke of Verdi, and subsequently Giuliana Tofana's mother is executed. And the narrative, the story follows Tofana as she enters the world of apothecaries and Aqua Tofana. The second book is called The Silkworm Keeper, and this is where Giuliana Tofana is living in a nunnery, which, as we've touched on in this podcast, may actually be truthful, may be factual. Anyway, Tofana's in the nunnery. A major disaster occurs, and then Giuliana Tofana is thrown back out into the world of Renaissance Italy, and it's not long before she's embroiled in the Aqua Tofana scandal yet again. The third book in the series is called The Fortune Keeper, and at this time Giuliana Tofana is on the run from the Duke of Verdi's family. So I won't tell you too much, but the reviews from the books are really good. A lot of people are just saying, like I've said, that they're really well researched, quite fast paced. So I think I'll be checking them out at some point soon. I've got a ton of books to read myself, but they'll make the list, definitely, for sure. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out our blog at themysteriesofhistory.com and social media outlets where we'll post extra info and images for each episode. So until next week, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.